So my job is a pretty simple one of asking how we can bring about a world in which research of the type that Raj and Mark just presented can routinely inform our policies in this country. And so, in other words, what I'm asking is how can we get to what might be called the Technocrats Dream world in which evidence-based policymaking is a reality. So what is this Technocrats Dream? Well, first off, you start with policies that are presumably an expression of the public will. And then, of course, we have to realize those objectives and goals in programs. And then, because programs often have unforeseen consequences, unintended consequences, we're going to want to evaluate those programs and see whether or not they're performing in the ways that we wanted them to perform, and we would then bring evidence to bear on those programs. And then on the basis of that evidence, we're going to revisit our policies and programs and rebuild them so that they're more in alignment with our objectives. So that's the dream, the dream of evidence-based policy. Of course, it hasn't quite yet been fully realized, and one might ask why. And there are two conventional stories that are proffered, I think, and they've been discussed at length already today as to why this dream hasn't been realized. Let me go over those conventional stories. The first one is that we have resistance from below. That is, we have top-down policymaking. Those who are charged with actually implementing those policies do so in a slow and imperfect way. The second conventional story, this is the story, I should say, that academics and scholars love. You know, we produce this awesome research evaluating programs and policies, and for some reason, it's not taken into account when policy making occurs. This is the politics trumps evidence story. So of course, both of those conventional accounts are in part on the mark, but the question I want to put to us is where is the biggest potential to disrupt some of these problems that prevent this evidence-based policymaking world from coming to fruition? And I would argue that the place where we can be most transformative is right here, addressing the evidence deficit. And by that I mean we need better data that will make it possible for us to deliver high-quality evidence on which programs are working and which ones aren't. That will obviously have the immediate advantage of allowing us to modify and reform existing programs on the basis of that evidence. That's immensely important. But it's also going to address some of these other problems that are the more conventionally proffered reasons for why we haven't yet realized this technocratic dream. In part, the reason why evidence that scholars bring to bear is ignored in the policymaking world is that it's a booming, buzzing confusion of evidence, evidence that's in part based on scholars trying to do the best they can with grossly inadequate data. And hence it's hard to get the policy read from this booming, buzzing confusion of evidence. If we had better data, that kind of booming, buzzing confusion would dissipate, and we'd have a clearer read on what works and what doesn't and what we ought to do. What about the other conventional story? It's the poor translation of policy story. Well, we don't know what works and what doesn't work. If we knew what works and what doesn't work, then of course it would be easier to go from policy to program. So the claim that I'm making is that, of course, there are many points to intervene in this cycle, but the place that's likely to be game-changing, the place that's likely to have the most transformative effect is to intervene on the evidence deficit, to develop a capacity to mine data for the purposes of informing us as to what works and what doesn't. And so I'm going to briefly lay out what I'm calling here the Chetty, Duggan, Grusky proposal. It's one of two proposals that Stanford selected to forward to the MacArthur competition. It's a three-step program to get us into this evidence-based policy world. We're going to put that movement, that evidence-based policymaking movement on steroids. So how do we propose to do that? 3 steps. The first one is to aggressively exploit existing administrative data. Second, and I'll talk a bit about that. The second is aggressive data linking. I'll talk about that. And the third is, of course, once we have this capacity in hand, exploit it to the hilt. At the end of the day, I'm going to argue if we did that, we can have a real and authentic evidence-based policy-making country. So let me start with the first step. Aggressively exploit administrative data. Now, why might you want to do that? First off, they're extremely high-quality data. A lot of money goes into collecting these data, and we ought to be able to use them then, not just for the purposes of running programs, but for evaluating them. Secondly, the marginal cost of using them is low. They're already being collected. We're putting lots of money into collecting these data. One might say that the Paperwork Reduction Act mandates that we should use these data for purposes of program evaluation. Low additional cost of using them. And secondly, they're big data. And this is something that came out of Mark's presentation. Because they're big data, because they're extremely large data sets, we can carry out quasi-experimental evaluations. For example, exploiting, as Mark discussed, state differences in the take-up of various types of programs. So how would you better exploit existing administrative data? We need an aggressive program of negotiating data sharing agreements. We're already doing that. A lot of foundations, some of whom are well represented here, are in the trenches, helping scholars, folks in government, lawyers negotiate these data sharing agreements. But what we're proposing is to put that existing effort on steroids. And in many ways, this is like the Human Genome Project. That wasn't sexy, that wasn't fun, that was lots of hard work that got the job done. The same sort of approach needs to be taken in terms of getting these data sharing agreements in place. That's step one. Step two, we have to link the administrative data once they're accessible for the purposes of program evaluation. In other words, what we want to do is convert what are typically cross-sectional data into a massive longitudinal panel. Why would you want to do that? Well, first off, programs typically have a wide range of effects, a wide gamut of effects across different types of outcomes, and the only way we're going to monitor that complicated set of effects is to link these data that allow us to do just that. The second point that needs to be made is that what we've learned, what might be called the iron law of program evaluation, is that typically effects are only well monitored when we can take into account long-run effects. And by linking data over time, converting cross-sectional data into longitudinal data, we can then monitor long-run effects of program participation. So sometimes we find, for example, that effects that appear in the short run wash out. Can't know that unless we have longitudinal data. Sometimes we find that effects that don't appear in the short run, they're sleeper effects. They come to appear later on. Sometimes we find that effects that aren't all that strong with respect to, say, adult recipients show up in a very big way intergenerationally in terms of effects on the children. We need linked data in order to tease out in a compelling way the various effects that these programs can have. And we can do that. We know how to do that. We just got to do it. Step three, once we have this massive longitudinal panel that could be analyzed in federal statistical research data centers, very high quality firewall, very safe and secure. Once we have this, we can become the world's leader in evidence-based policy. We just have to exploit now that extraordinary data that would now be available. What would that mean to exploit that capacity? Two things. We want to evaluate existing programs aggressively. We've got to choose the most important programs, the programs on which we're spending the most money that matter the most in terms of getting the outcomes about which we care the most. We've got to choose those programs and evaluate them with the highest quality data. We've got to systematically go through all of the programs. There's a lot of work to be done, but we would then have the capacity to do it. And then secondly, with data of this sort, we can use those data for the purposes of reforming existing programs. And Elizabeth Mason will talk a bit about that. This wouldn't cost that much. There are, to be sure, one-time costs. The cost of negotiating these data sharing agreements, not trivial, but certainly within our capacity. The cost of linking, not trivial, but certainly within our capacity. Once we bear these one-time costs, the ongoing costs will be relatively small. We got to append new data as they become available, new census data, other types of administrative data as they become available. And then, of course, we have to exploit this new capacity through carrying out the evaluation research that I've discussed. But at the end of the day, we could lead the world in having a public sector that works efficiently. So that's a very high, that's a big benefit for what would, at the end of the day, be a relatively low cost. So let me just conclude by discussing why we must do it and do it now. Obviously, some will say it's just too hard. There's a lot of obstacles that have to be overcome. But I would say there's too much at stake to be deterred by those obstacles. I think all of them can be surmounted. And there are reasons why we need to do it right now. First off, if we're committed, as it seems that we are, to running a very small and lean public sector, if that's our commitment, we have to make sure, and Dave focused on this point, we have to make sure we spend every dollar wisely. So now is the time to make sure that we do that. One way to look at it is to ask, what is this country all about? What do we stand for? And of course, we've always been deeply committed to the invisible hand delivering good outcomes in the private sector. That will always be part of our DNA. But there's another part of our DNA that I don't think has been well understood. We're a pragmatic people. We're dedicated to efficiency. We're dedicated to ensuring that we set up our institutions in ways that they work and deliver the outcomes that we want. And that means that we have to attend in the public sector to the visible hand of evidence. That's the analog to the invisible hand within the private sector. We're a country that should very straightforwardly commit to both of these principles. What if we don't? Well, then we're going to lose an international competition that's ongoing. Other countries are doing this. They have the capacity to evaluate their programs. Why is it that we often try to garner the effects of programs by going to Sweden? Because they have the data that makes it possible to do that. But then we have to make this huge leap of faith that what we find in Sweden might actually also apply here. We ought not have to do that. But lots of countries are building infrastructures of this sort. If we don't do the same, we're going to lose the competition and not build a public sector that's as efficient as is in play in other countries. Final point, why we should do it now. I think we're at a critical moment in the evidence-based policymaking movement. It's a moment at which a lot of cynicism could set in, and we might abandon the project as an impossible dream. If we put it on steroids right now, if we commit, if we go all in on this, we could overcome that cynicism, and we could have a public sector that's the envy of the world. Thank you.